We have been seeing for the past decades an increase in deforestation. And the reason the deforestation is so high is because the commodities that we all depend on, particularly food production, that goes globally. It's not just food that is consumed in Brazil, but actually it's consumed in China, in the US, in the EU, pushes the frontier of production and basically generates a difference in terms of the return that the forest can yield in terms of financial resources and the production.
Hey everyone, we are excited to launch a new podcast series in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, The Road to COP30. Throughout September, we'll be speaking with leaders from the Nature Conservancy across Latin America to explore their work ahead of COP30, taking place this November in Pará State, Brazil. On this episode, we sit down with Jose Passos, director of the Brazilian Amazon for the Nature Conservancy, to discuss the vital role traceability plays in combating deforestation. In the Amazon, cattle ranching has long been a major driver of forest loss. But through the Pará Sustainable Cattle Program, Jose and his team are working to change that, tracking animals from birth to slaughter to ensure cattle are not linked to deforested land. Join us as we unpack the economic forces behind deforestation, the challenges of balancing livelihoods and conservation, and why traceability could be the key to protecting the Amazon's future. I think I'll start off with you, Jose. Could you talk about your background in the work that you do with the Nature Conservancy?
Sure, Preston. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk about this topic that's so important, which is tackling deforestation in a critical biome like the Amazon. So my name is Jose Passos. I'm the director for the Brazilian Amazon. My background is actually on economics and finance, where I started my career. But for the past 6.5 years, I have been working with the Conservancy. And we have been trying to develop a lot of different initiatives and approaches for promoting sustainability in the Amazon, which means not just tackling deforestation, but also guaranteeing improving livelihoods of the people that live in the Amazon, working with commodities to guarantee that they are free of any kind of deforestation, like the cattle ranch that we will talk a lot in the next segments. So, and because of my background in economics, we have been trying to bring a lot of innovation in the financial space, which is a critical component that I would be happy to talk afterwards.
The first thing to kind of kick us off here, Jose, I'll ask, we're focused in this episode on deforestation, traceability with deforestation, but what is deforestation and why does deforestation happen? Specifically looking at an area like the Brazilian Amazon.
Sure, Preston. I think that's something that we hear so much about, deforestation, but it ends up being something intangible, right? Why it happens, why people go crazy and start deforesting and cutting down forests. And of course, there is a very logical explanation that is actually pretty complex, which is the roots come from the way we see nature and the way we have been occupying land across the world, not just in Brazil, but across the world. The fact is that in the Brazilian Amazon, or in the Amazon more generally, we have been able to protect it very well because it's logistically more challenging, because people have been protecting it, particularly indigenous people and local communities, and because of the sheer size of it. So the Amazon is so big that we managed to protect it. But also we have been able to protect it because of the creation of protected units, conservation units. So we have protected areas. Just in Brazil, 50% of the Amazon is already protected under some form of protection. And this is one of the reasons when we look at the map, you see basically green. But not everything is good news. We have been seeing for the past decades an increase in deforestation. And the reason the deforestation is so high is because the commodities that we all depend on, particularly food production, that goes globally. It's not just food that is consumed in Brazil, but actually it's consumed in China, in the US, in the EU, pushes the frontier of production and basically generates a difference in terms of the return that the forest can yield in terms of financial resources and the production. So there is a big gap in terms of the financial return when you talk about a production like cattle ranching, or even bigger with soy, than the forest that doesn't generate revenues. So you create the perfect incentive for the expansion of the agricultural frontier because of that difference in terms of the return of the economic activity. In a nutshell, is this. Of course, there is a lot different components of it. So the commodities is one of the drivers, but there is a very important component that is often overlooked. Sorry to jump to that, but I think it's important to introduce, which is the real estate value. So whenever you have a production, let's say cattle, the land value, the value of the real estate is 4 times higher than the value with forest, with native vegetation. So this is a big economic push for deforestation, because automatically after the deforestation, when you start producing cattle, for example, your real estate increases four times the value. If you change to soy, that value increases by 20 times. So you see that there is a immediate return of doing that through the real estate valuation.
Last year, we did a series with Nature Conservancy in Latin America, and we actually spoke with Mauricio, who I think is the Gran Chaco lead for the Nature Conservancy. Talked about regenerative agriculture, and that was honestly, since I've been doing the podcast, one of my favorite episodes we've done, because the way he broke down regenerative agriculture was, I thought it was very elementary, where anyone could understand it. When I think about a lot of these topics, sometimes they can be very complex, but I did want to throw that in there because Mauricio with regenerative agriculture, it was a really cool kind of conversation that was had last year. Looking back at Brazil for a second, Jose, and you had mentioned in your intro, when you're talking about the Brazilian Amazon region, you're talking about the cattle industry and talking about how real estate was the economic value of the real estate with cattle on it was so much higher than that of forest. I do want to understand, cattle ranching, the role of Pará in Brazil's cattle industry, and just cattle ranching in general.
Yeah, so the Pará state is the second largest state in Brazil. It's 3 times the size of California. So when you look in the map, it doesn't show up, but it's actually 3 times the size of California. So that's how big it is. And cattle is super important for the economy of that specific state. But cattle is also important for the economics of the frontier areas. And not just in Brazil. I mean, any frontier area that you get across the world will probably have some form of land occupation, some form of this, keeping the livelihoods of the people that go to those frontier areas, which are rough areas, they are complex, they don't have the logistic. And cattle actually makes sense in those kinds of areas because you basically have grasslands, you put the cattle there, and it requires very little labor, so you don't have to hire a lot of people. That isn't available anyway. So it's basically family farming, smallholders that go to the frontier areas. They have been incentivized for the past decades to do that, to go from the southern Brazil to the north of Brazil. And Pará is no exception. In the state of Pará alone, we have 250,000 smallholders that have been incentivized to come and occupy since the late 70s, so the 1970s. And the cheapest way to start a production is actually cattle. You buy some cattle, you breed, and then you basically open new areas. You deforest new areas. If you're a smallholder, it's what Josefina was telling us. How can you tell that person, that family that has its livelihood threatened, that they can't open a new area, that they can deforest a new area that's part of their property? In Brazil, we do have a law that requires them to keep at least 50% of their forest. But no one pays for that 50%. So there is a tricky situation where they have to comply with the law, they have to keep that area, but they still need to produce. Nevertheless, the areas that they have to produce is basically pasture lands. So they deforest, they put pasture. So cattle makes sense to occupy those kinds of lands, either for a smallholder that doesn't have a lot of capital to invest on high-tech stuff like agriculture, or to a land grabber that wants to grab a land, steal basically a land, deforest, and then sell that land. How that person can justify the occupation of that land? Cattle is kind of the logical choice because it's cheap. Cattle can occupy the land. It can justify an economic activity. So cattle can play a role for the land grabber as justifying an occupation. That is illegal and will be punished. But when you think about frontiers, it takes time for that group to be punished. So when you get all that, you created the perfect scenario for cattle production to thrive. You accumulate that across many decades. What you have is a thriving and very important economic activity, which is cattle ranching on the frontier areas. Pará alone has 26 million heads of cattle right now. So I think that's a third, if I'm not mistaken, a third of the herd of the US. So that's how huge the economic is. It's the second biggest herd in the states of Brazil. The largest one is Mato Grosso. And it's the most important economic activity for 100,000 smallholders. So it's a very important activity for those small producers, those family farmers that depend on that kind of activity to live.
So I was reading this report. It's a 2020 study that the Nature Conservancy conducted with Bain & Company, and it was titled Brazil's Path to Sustainable Cattle Farming. It's a long report. I think it was about 30, 40 pages, but inside that report, it talks about the Pará Sustainable Cattle Program. How this was put into place. I think, let me see my notes, in November of 2023. And it says this program was structured around 3 pillars: traceability, integrity, and lastly, adding value. Could you give us an idea about what this sustainable cattle program is in regards to these 3 things: traceability, integrity, and added value?
Sure, and this is a very exciting program. So we talked before about the drivers of deforestation, and cattle, for the second thing I mentioned, is one of the drivers, right? So we know that cattle can be one of the drivers of deforestation, but we also, as I mentioned before, recognize that it is an important economic activity, and it's an important activity for food security across the world. So one of the things that people have been trying to tackle for many years is cattle-driven deforestation. So many attempts have been tried in terms of identifying where the cattle is coming from. And I need to take a step back. So Brazil has 2 things that are kind of enabling conditions that allow us to promote a program like the one I'm going to talk about. The first one is we have a forest law that's also is very strict. And it also establishes the second thing, which is a system, a geospatial system, maps, that you have the boundaries of each property and the environmental compliance or the environmental condition of that property. So let's say I have a farm. My farm needs to be on the map, on that public system, and the situation of the farm, if I have forest, where it is, if I have pasture, where the pasture is in my property, will be uploaded into that system. So the government and everyone else has every polygon, every farm on a system, and it can evaluate, comparing with the law, if that farm is compliant with the law, if it has the amount of forest you need to have, if it needs to restore to be able to be compliant, if it deforests. The other thing that we have is a satellite system that monitors deforestation. So with that, they can know if I deforested and I'm now not in compliant with the law. Why I'm saying all this? Because that different systems combined with the law, combined with the satellite image that we have, allow us to identify properties that need to restore. And it also helps us identify areas that are red hotspots of deforestation. So when you combine that with traceability data, you can actually identify cattle that may be coming from deforested areas. Why maybe? Because right now the system, the traceability system that we have in Brazil, which is actually pretty advanced and is enough for most countries, is done by batches. So you put a whole batch of cattle inside a truck, and you say that this truck is coming from this place to the other place, to one farm to the other farm. And then when it gets to that farm, it gets mixed with other cattle that was in that farm. And then you have the other truck that will get that cattle from the second farm, and then we'll take to the meat packer. So it's different from systems that have feedlots, because we have a vertically integrated system where the smallholders sell to medium farmers that sell to large cattle ranchers and then sell to meat packers. So when you get all that, you get cross-contamination of cattle that's coming from deforested areas with cattle that's not coming from deforested areas, and you lose track of that. You lose track of where the cattle is actually coming from if it's not a direct supplier, which is the last link before the meat packer. So what Pará has established is individual cattle traceability. So instead of doing by batches, each cattle from birth to slaughter will be traced with a very cheap system, ear tags, that you can actually tell exactly where it was born and each farm along the way where it was until its slaughter. So with that, you can actually identify with this, the information that I mentioned, the geospatial information about the farm, if it's coming or not from deforested areas. And therefore, you basically block any kind of cattle that is coming from deforested areas, making it unviable to produce cattle in deforested areas. So that's kind of the principle of the program, and this is mandatory. So all the 26 million heads of cattle that Pará has will need to be traced individually by the end of next year. So it can't be just about command and control. It can't be just another requirement, particularly for the smallholders. And that's why Pará, very intelligently, included two other things in the program. So let's not just talk about traceability, because it can't be a silver bullet. Let's help create a pathway for compliance. So help farmers that deforested, especially the small ones, restore the areas. So forest restoration, which is something that we are very happy to promote, and add value on a low productivity activity. So let's increase productivity. Let's increase the value of the integrity and transparency that we are promoting. So those are the two other big components that were packed into that program, which makes it even more impactful because of that integrated approach.
So a couple of questions I have on that. I think you did a great job. I can clearly see how this works with the geo mapping, with the ear tags. I would be curious about, with the geo mapping and the software, if it identifies an area where deforestation is happening, I would call these people bad actors. What happens to these people? Is this where the government comes in and there's some sort of punishment that comes about? What all happens when there's deforestation that's identified, again, in this geomapping software?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is two things that can happen, right? The first thing is the area could be blocked by the environmental agency in Brazil. So there will be kind of geo-blocking of the area. So if you actually entering the system, you could see, okay, so this area is blocked. So this area shouldn't be producing. And then if auditor from the government goes into that area and there is production, then there could be fines for that. The other thing is that there could be a commercial blocking. So if I'm a meat packer and I'm buying cattle and I identify that that cattle is coming from a deforested area, what I can do is I simply block that supplier. So that would push that supplier outside of the formal value chain, outside of the formal economic value chain, right? So those are the two things that usually happen when you have deforestation. What happens is that a lot of the deforestation occurs on smallholders. You remember the 100,000 smallholders. And actually, a lot of the deforestation already happened 10 years ago. It shouldn't, but it happened. So the smallholders right now, because of the traceability system, we don't have full visibility because they don't sell directly. Most of them don't sell directly to the meat packer. They sell to someone that sells to someone, then sells to the meat packer. So that we don't have full visibility that that cattle is actually coming from a smallholder with a deforested area. All right. The reason why they sell to others is because the pasture, just to explain, which I think is important. The pasture can't hold a very heavy cattle. It requires more pasture. If you don't invest in pasture, it loses its capacity to produce grass as much as that cattle that's fattening needs. So as the requirement for calories for grass of that cattle increases with weight, that smallholder doesn't have the capital to invest in better pasture, so it needs to get rid of the cattle. So that's why they sell to someone that has a better pasture, then sells to someone that has a better pasture until you get to the big one that has more intensified protection system, right? So that just to explain that part, which I think it's not as obvious in that sense. So if you have a smallholder that deforested, and now you can identify, because you have individual traceability, the potential consequences for that smallholder would be mostly the market consequences, because in terms of fines, they are poor people that probably don't have the resources to pay for fines, so they would be blocked commercially. They wouldn't be able to sell their cattle to anyone. So that's why we have the second component, which is to guarantee inclusion of those smallholders, to create a pathway for compliance. So, okay, you deforested in the past. Now let's create a plan, and that's according to the Brazilian law of the forest law. Let's create a plan so you can restore the area you deforested and you can come back to compliance, so you're not blocked in the way of selling your cattle. So that's kind of creating the kind of carrot, the stick and the carrot, right? You create the stick. Now you need the carrot to guarantee that you don't create exclusion and you don't foster a parallel economy that's outside of the scope and outside of the visibility of everyone.
So I did write down a couple notes. What just came to mind is really looking at the economics too. So if you have a traceable cattle, let's say, supply chain, and you're able to see every point of it, I think about the product in the hands of a consumer. Like I go to a grocery store right now. If I go and get beef, maybe it'll say, grass-fed beef, it'll say vegan, it'll say these different things on it. Can the farmers themselves use things like this was traceable beef through the supply chain? Can they say it was deforestation-free beef? I'm just trying to think from an economic lens too, how they can promote the good that's going on inside this region.
So that's exactly the third component of the program, which is, okay, so if there is a grass-fed cattle that you can actually trace to origin, there is just two countries that do that, Uruguay and Australia right now. There isn't any other countries that are doing this at scale, just Australia and Uruguay. So you can trace back to origin. It's grass-fed. It's helping smallholders. On the same property that cattle was produced, they have 50% of protected forest by law, which is the Brazilian law. So that needs to be valued in some way, right? There needs to be a way to value that cattle that's actually helping that smallholder stay where they are and protect 50% of the property that they can't touch. It's protected by law. So that cattle is actually helping that bigger system of protection in a way. So this third component is trying to guarantee that we are actually accounting for the proper value of transparency, of integrity, of the restoration that's happening on the ground, of the quality that's improved. Because if there is any kind of sanitary issues, you can actually trace back and you can actually take actions much quicker. If you have that kind of individual system, you know exactly what kind of disease that cattle has, where it has been, where you have a focus, so it can guarantee better food security as well. And finally, if you have food traceability, and this is something that's a little more indirect from that system, what you can do is you can increase productivity. Why? If you have control of your herd, individual control, you know which cattle are gaining fat, gaining weight quicker. We know which cows are giving birth in better numbers. You know where is the cattle is coming from, what's the genetics. You know, you can actually make a math and put that into your accounting system, how much money you are putting. You can better manage your vaccine, so you can lower your costs. So this is a very important side benefit of that system, because you have that view at the property level, but also at the herd level. You can actually improve the protection and the productivity. You can improve the food quality. So all of that needs to be accounted for and valued. And this is something that we have been trying to work on. How can we work with markets, particularly retailers, on actually generating that value and paying to the smallholders, especially smallholders, for that additional value that's being generated in the production system?
Yeah, I think that the final kind of you can call it section that we'll talk on is, where do we go from here? Obviously, I mean, a lot of this conversation we focus in Pará State in Brazil. Here in the next 6 months, there's going to be a massive event in Pará State, which is COP30. Hundreds of thousands of people gathering together to try to push the climate agenda forward. And it's right inside Pará State, which is where we've been talking a lot about the cattle industry. So I would just ask you, how could, or how do you see, how does the Nature Conservancy see COP30 as a turning point in terms of deforestation, in terms of traceability? You have the global community together inside inside Brazil. What do you hope is accomplished at this huge event?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually live in Belém. So I
Oh,
actually live in COP30 as we speak, where I'm seeing the public works, the construction every day. So, and it has become pretty intense. I think the first thing we need to accomplish is now take advantage that we're having COP for the first time in the Amazon to recognize the value of nature for tackling climate change, right? So there is a big discussion about energy. Energy is super important. It should be one of our focus, but we can't overlook nature as a big solution for tackling climate change. Not just for reducing emissions that are caused in the land use sector, like deforestation, but also as a potential for sequestering the carbon, a part of the carbon. So when we talk about restoration, about compliance, about restoring the areas that were deforested, we're actually talking about a natural climate solution, a solution to sequester the carbon using those small holders and the connection that they have to the cattle value chain to promote the reduction in the CO2 equivalent concentration, right? So we're trying to sequester that using restoration. So it's a natural climate solution. So I think the first thing is recognizing the value of nature. The second one that I briefly mentioned now, it's the co-benefits of. There are so many co-benefits. So the improved livelihoods of the people that live here, the biodiversity value that this will generate, which is another crisis that's not part of COP, the climate COP that we'll have, but it was part of the discussions during Cali COP, the biodiversity COP that happened last year. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're also talking about the co-benefits in terms of biodiversity. That area that I said is protected and that area that I said needs to be restored for smallholders are areas that will basically guarantee the level of biodiversity or even improve in some places. So that's the second thing. And with that, I think the third thing that we need to accomplish is the interconnection of those agendas. So we often talk about deforestation as if it was bad guys deforesting and not part of a whole system of exploration of our natural resources. So we need to see the interconnection. I think COP30 needs to accomplish that in order for us all to identify that the discussions between food systems, climate, livelihoods, and finance are totally interconnected. And with that, maybe we can end COP with a final thing, which is we need capital to do all that. So there is already a program established in Pará. The national government in Brazil has already established an individual cattle traceability program as well. And they also created a program to recover pasture, which, again, it's a super important move in terms of sustainability. But now we need to mobilize capital to guarantee that there is enough resources to implement all this. And all this takes money, to transform a whole system into individual traceability, to guarantee that we can restore the areas that were deforested, to improve the production. It takes an investment, an initial investment. And this is not what we need to focus. How can we deliver that and mobilize those resources? And what kind of mechanism we need to create to guarantee that they are viable on the long term from a public perspective, but also from a private perspective. So I hope we can achieve that. So that interconnection between food systems, finance, climate, and livelihoods.